One more sleep, everyone. Just one more sleep till it's all over. This time tomorrow, the polls will have opened, and of course, the podcast won't be doing anything even vaguely political. So we thought we'd take this final opportunity to check in on the campaign trail. For the last 6 weeks, our team of political correspondents have been touring the country on the battle buses, seeing up close the efforts to secure your vote and the Sky TV login for number 10. I'm Niall Paterson, and in this edition of The Daily, having been up close and personal with all the key players, we'll be asking our correspondents for their reflections on the campaign and the moments that for them define the 2024 general election. And we begin with the Liberal Democrats. Matthew Thompson has been following them from Sky. He speaks to us from the upper deck, I believe, of the Lib Dem battle bus. Look, you've not been short of a stunt or two during this election, I think it's fair to say, Matthew. Run us through them, because I think I've actually lost count.
Honestly, so have I. There've been so many. They actually have been getting progressively more extreme. You know, only a couple of days ago, Ed Davey did a bungee jump, which I think was the most extraordinary one that we've yet seen. But just off the top of my head, we saw him paddleboarding on Lake Windermere, and I was in a kayak, or as we dubbed it, the Skyak. We went on a slip and slide with him. He's been on amusement park rides at Thorpe Park. He's done archery. He's done an assault course. He went surfing the other day. I mean, honestly, there are dozens. It's been quite something to behold, and clearly, they're going really hard at it. They think it's working for them, and we are promised. This is our penultimate stop for the day, but we are promised that they aren't quite finished. So we're expecting a grand flourish to finish off with at some point later today. God knows what it's going to be.
Ed Davey being fired out of a cannon. You heard it here first.
Shark diving, surely.
But you say that the Lib Dems think this is working for them. In what manner? You know, it's provided me with plenty of laughs. See Ed Davey in a wetsuit again, knowing, of course, that you will be in a wetsuit alongside him very shortly. But what is it supposed to be doing, apart from giving us all a bit of a laugh?
Yeah, I almost started just coming for the day's events in my wetsuit because it was getting so absurd. But look, what does it achieve? And they've been very open with us about this in terms of, when we have behind the scenes conversations with his strategists. They're very conscious that they are not yet the third party, right? They want to be the third party. Polls suggest they might well be the third party, but they aren't yet. And they have a job in terms of just getting coverage, because most of the coverage, understandably, focuses on the Tories and the Labour, who's going to be the next Prime Minister. So it was a way of making sure that Ed Davey was in the conversation, getting him noticed. There is some evidence that it is working. So we were in a service station just getting breakfast, and a bunch of young people were there, and just spontaneously a few of these young kids, I think probably 16 or so, just shouted, Ed Davey, Ed Davey, and they sort of flocked towards him. I don't know, but I'd kind of been surprised if that would have happened 4 or 5 weeks ago, because he's just been doing the rounds on Instagram and TikTok. These people are seeing him. And then if you look, as I say, the more scientific stuff, so Ipsos, one of the pollsters that tracks party approval or party leader approval ratings, and they've shown that Ed Davey's approval ratings have actually gone up 7 points since the start of June. He now has a net approval rating of -5, which does sound quite low, but quite often politicians are in the negatives, and actually Keir Starmer's on, according to the same measure, -19, for example, Rishi Sunak on -55. So it's not just the Lib Dems saying it. There are some, as I say, both anecdotal and slightly more scientific measures that seem to suggest the strategy's been working for them.
Sure, but haven't they raised expectations? When you have this prominence, be it through silly stunts or policy announcements, people do start to believe that you should be picking up seats.
The polls for all the parties, particularly the Tories, but certainly for the Lib Dems, it's a very wide spread. And I think there is a bit of jitters that I've been picking up the last few days, at least, from senior Liberal Democrat sources, that actually certainly the polls, the coverage is leading people's expectations to rise to the point where what would ordinarily be considered a good night, even a 40-plus performance, might start to look like underachievement given where the polls and some of the expectations are. So there's been a subtle, I think, in the last few days, attempt at some expectation management in that regard.
This perhaps will be the most difficult question for you to answer, Matthew, because frankly, you've had a ball for the past 6 weeks. Looking back on this Lib Dem campaign. Was there a moment, is there a day that you will be thinking of when reflecting on general election 2024 in the years to come?
I think probably it's the day that Sir Ed and I both went down a giant slip and slide in a rubber ring. If only because, as some wag tweeted at the time, is this the first time a senior politician has done a serious political interview whilst straddling the journalist? Possible that we made some electoral history there. But I just think that for me will sum up the campaign, because at the same time as doing something frankly a little bit daft, we also did a bit of proper political interviewing. And I think that has really, the balance there has summed up what the campaign has been for me. Yes, I've been joining in and getting involved in the wetsuits, but also we've been conscious that we aren't just here for a jolly and a ride along, and we actually do have some holding to account to do. And we've been trying to mix the two of them. And that sort of encapsulates both of those things coming together in one slightly outrageous afternoon's fun and games.
OK, next we are in Scotland, specifically in Cumbernauld. Our correspondent Connor Gillies has been following the SNP at this election and, of course, the broader political landscape where he is. Connor, look, we entered this campaign assuming that the SNP were going to be losing seats. I'm just wondering how that has affected the way in which they fought this election.
Yeah, it's not been a great time for the SNP, and they knew that fine well going into this election campaign, and their new leader, John Swinney, took the reins just a couple of weeks before this election was called, and he has been trying to manage expectations. He kept saying over and over and over again, it's been a tough, rough time for the party, and that was the kind of starting position for the SNP in this campaign. They have had extraordinary electoral success in Scotland for a very long time, and there was a sense that after 17 years in government here in Scotland, close to 2 decades at the helm of domestic policies like the NHS, the education system, the justice system, that actually was this going to be the moment that they would be punished for some of the failings in their domestic agenda here in Scotland and the chaos that has engulfed the party for the past year or so. And the polls have been a bit erratic, actually, over the past few weeks. Some saying, look, they're going to be down to as few as 3 or 4 seats from the high 40s. Some saying they'll get 20, 30. And then a shock poll today on the final day of the campaign saying, look, it's neck and neck. It's too close to call between them and Labour. I think that tells a story about how this election feels different in a way that it hasn't done for a long time north of the border.
It certainly does, and I doubt the SNP will care for this to be pointed out, but I suppose there is a parallel between the Conservatives and the SNP in that they have both been in government for quite so long. And I suppose perhaps also a parallel between Rishi Sunak and John Swinney.
Yeah, that's right. And, he's been around the block a long time. He was seen as a trusted pair of hands to take over the party in what has been a really torrid period. But the big issue that he has faced is that if we put aside the police investigation and all the issues that the party is dealing with domestically here, their central founding mission is, of course, the cause of Scottish independence. It's page 1, line 1 of their manifestos, but the SNP knows that it cannot deliver an independence referendum on its own. And we're in this interesting scenario, I was going to try and pick my words carefully there, interesting scenario where John Swinney is telling voters at this election, and he's been telling us here at Sky News in pretty much every interview, that the SNP could lose seats at this election, which the polls suggest is going to happen, and they could still open negotiations with Westminster for another referendum. And even if they lose this election and Labour win here in Scotland, they would revert back to the mandate, in their words, from the 2021 Scottish election and say, aha, right, well, we didn't win in this election, but we won in 2021, so we'll use that ticket to essentially open those negotiations. And that opens John Swinney and the SNP up to criticism and looking a bit on the ropes, I suppose, is a fair way of putting it when it comes to that independence question.
I think it is a very fair way to put it. And Connor, what about your kind of personal highlight from the SNP campaign? 50 years from now, when you're sitting down with your cup of Builders, wrapped up in your tartan rug, What will you think of when you think of the SNP in 2024?
Not that we're doing Scottish stereotypes or anything here. I mean, talk for yourself. Talk for yourself. But I mean, I think my highlight, put aside the politics and the relentless interviews with the politicians, we were in Asda a couple of weeks ago. John Swinney was doing an event, and you know, we thought, how do we spice this up? How do we keep ourselves sane in this general election campaign? So we thought, what better to do than go supermarket sweep and go live from the aisles of the supermarket and essentially pounce on people live on air on Sky News and ask them what their views were. And it was interesting. One woman was like, refused to speak to me, which was incredibly awkward live on television. And then I went up to another elderly lady. It was actually the day of the Sky News debate with Beth Rigby in Grimsby. I said, are you going to be watching? You know, it's a big moment. And obviously our office and our team at Sky News were getting super excited about this. And this woman turned around and goes, nah, I'll be in my bed. I think that was kind of symptomatic of this election campaign so far.
Well, let's think about what's been happening with the Reform campaign. So we head where else but to Clacton Pier, where we'll find Gurpreet Narwan, who's been following the Reform campaign. Look, Gurpreet, we would, of course, still have been talking about Reform and the squeeze that they would put on the Conservatives, even if he hadn't returned. But return he did. Nigel Farage is basically the story of the campaign for Reform.
Yeah, it was about a month ago to this day, actually, that Nigel Farage decided to step into the Reform UK campaign by taking over as leader and running as an MP. Well, that completely transformed the campaign for Reform UK, I think. I remember during those early days when Richard Tice was the leader of Reform UK, we were at the campaign launch, and there was barely any people in the room. I think 17 people in total were in that room. And then when Nigel Farage announced that he was going to be running and taking over as leader, I mean, you could just see it in the polls, just how much it elevated their campaign. At points, Reform UK overtaking the Tories.
Yeah, I take the point about the popularity that Nigel Farage has and the effect that he has on people, whichever part of the country seemingly he travels to. But do Reform stand any chance, a snowballs in hell, for example, of actually picking up seats?
Well, it's a good question. Some polls have suggested that Reform UK could win 7 seats. That would be ambitious, because other polls suggest that they're going to win no seats at all. I think what is clear from the polls is that Reform UK have picked up vote share. At the start of this campaign, they were on about quite a stubborn 10%. Now, something in the region of 15, 16, maybe 17%. Some of them have suggested that they've overtaken the Conservatives. But the nature of our electoral system means that those votes won't necessarily be converted into seats. And that's something that might be a story after this election. If Reform UK do indeed overtake the Conservatives when it comes to vote share, you can expect that there's going to be a huge clamour from this party for a move towards a system of proportional representation.
Completely agree that they have picked up votes and picked up vote share, Gurpreet. But, you know, they have done so from the rather privileged position of being able to say anything they like, put forward any policies they like in their manifesto in full knowledge that they're never going to have to live up to it, that they're never going to be the next government.
Yeah, you know, being at the press conferences with Reform UK, the types of questions they're being asked have changed since they've started climbing up the polls. They are being scrutinised on their policies a lot more than they used to be. And although he is incredibly popular with some people, more popular, I think, than Starmer with Labour supporters or Rishi Sunak with Conservative supporters, he also attracts a lot of feeling in the opposite direction as well.
Indeed, and if the comments made previously by Nigel Farage have become a bit of a thorn in Reform's side, so too, perhaps doubly so, the comments of a number of Reform's candidates standing in this general election. There has been a real issue around allegations of racism.
Look, I think all parties have had some issues with their candidates, especially with such a sort of short lead time to the general election. But we've been getting kind of a trickle of revelations when it comes to Reform candidates from the beginning of the campaign. Behind the scenes, they feel like they've been fighting fires left, right and centre. And it's emboldened the Conservatives now to make those direct attacks. But whether at this late stage they will have an impact, we don't know.
OK, Gurpreet, looking back on the past 6 weeks, what for you was the point that defines this Reform 2024 election campaign?
Yeah, so I think the funniest moment for me in the campaign was in the early days. And although Richard Tice was the leader of Reform UK, barely anyone knew who he was. Everyone was asking for selfies with Nigel Farage. People were shoving their camera phones into Richard Tice's hands, asking him to take selfies of them with Nigel. And we walked into a working men's club where Nigel Farage went to the bar to order some pints for him and his team. He asked everybody what they wanted, and unfortunately Richard Tice didn't get the offer of a pint. So he walked up to the bar next to Nigel Farage and ordered his 0% Guinness all by himself, putting in several £1 million of his own money into the campaign, but in the end had to buy his own pint, which I think sums it up.
Certainly does. Gurpreet, many thanks. Time for a quick breather. When we return, we'll check in on Labour and the Conservatives, with the polls opening in just a few hours' time. Welcome back to the Sky News Daily Podcast, where we are continuing our tour around the battle buses of General Election 2024. Next up, the Conservatives, on board with them, our man Darren McCaffrey. Darren, good to see you. Look, Rishi Sunak's campaign, I don't think you can fault him for the amount of effort that he has been putting in, but from day one, he has been facing a massive gap in the polls, and that is a massive gap that he has failed to narrow.
Completely failed at Neil to narrow, and you're right, it started day one getting absolutely soaked in Downing Street, and really that set the tone for this campaign. It's been kind of mishap and problems continually throughout this campaign. Now, you've been also right in saying he's been quite tiggerish, he's been moving around the country an awful lot. You would never know that this is a man who's facing potentially an historic electoral defeat, but we also can't forget D-Day. We can't forget the betting gamble gate scandal. We can't forget talking about Sky TV that people routinely bring up to me. He started 20 points behind. We're now a day out from polling, and they're still fundamentally 20 points behind.
You say we wouldn't have known that he was facing an almighty drubbing at the polls. I'm going to challenge that slightly, given that all we have heard from the Conservatives for the past couple of weeks has been, don't give Labour a supermajority, which strikes me, what kind of a tactic is that, to go into polling day admitting defeat, as indeed Rishi Sunak has almost, but people like Mel Stride, his colleague, certainly have?
Yeah, and it's extraordinary. I can't remember a general election campaign where particularly the governing party have effectively gone into polling day conceding defeats. There are some within the party who aren't terribly happy about it, but clearly the Conservatives feel that it may well convince some Tory voters who might well have stayed at home or who might have kind of hovered over the ballot paper tomorrow to actually stick with the Conservative Party. And it is being brought up on the doorstep. I've spent a lot of time with Conservative activists, and they do say it is something that is making people think again.
You mentioned some of it already, starting the campaign, soaked to the skin in Downing Street because he couldn't remember to bring an umbrella from the building behind him. Then you fast forward on to another couple of catastrophes, one has to describe them as, the absolutely daft decision to leave the beaches of Normandy early, and of course the absolutely daft decision of some of his closest political allies to place money on the date of the election.
And that's been the big problem, is that many of these errors have been errors that they've created. They've shot themselves in the foot. It's not come from external things. It's not that Labour have somehow surprised them or ambushed them with these enormous announcements or change in tactics. Largely, the faltering of this Conservative campaign has come within the Conservative camp, as you say, whether it's D-Day or whether it's on Gamblegate itself. None of this needed to happen, and that's been the big problem for the Conservative Party in this campaign, is that in theory the one thing, irrespective of the last 14 years, that they potentially had some control over was when the election was called and how it was going to be run. And yet even on that measurement, it's not gone terribly well.
It sounds to me, Daz, like the people on the bus, like me, get the feeling that most Conservatives are already thinking, about the other side of the election, be it what they're going to do next when they're no longer a member of Parliament, or secondly, who's actually going to be leading the party the other side of the election.
Yeah, that battle has essentially already begun. Soila Braverman writing, the former Home Secretary, in the Telegraph, making it clear that she's not very happy with the Conservative leadership ahead of polling day when the party's meant to be united. But why is she doing that? She's doing that because almost certainly if she's still an MP, she's going to try and run as leader. We know that they're all waiting in the wings, waiting for Friday before potentially launching into an absolute blitz this summer of trying to become Conservative leader. But you're also right. Many of them might not be MPs in 2 days' time.
OK then, Darren, your moment of the campaign, viewed as it has been from your seat there on the Conservative Venga bus.
You know what? It has to be food. So it's not a moment, it's a continuous moment. I mean, I can hardly fit into my suit. We have been fed copious amounts of sandwiches, fish and chips, McDonald's, cakes, often sometimes by the Prime Minister as well throughout this campaign. And honestly, all I can tell you on Friday is I'm going to go on a summer diet.
I look forward to seeing the slimmed down version of Darren McCaffrey back in the office sometime soon. For now, though, Darren, thanks very much indeed. Well, of course, final stop on the tour around the general election will be Labour. So we head to Cardiff Airport where we'll find Sky's Serena Barker-Singh. Serena, good to see you. Just characterise Sir Keir Starmer's campaign for us, because, you know, on day one, he went into this with a significant lead over the Conservatives. We're fast approaching the final day of the campaign, and he has maintained that lead.
Yes, and I think that's been the biggest struggle for Labour. They've been so worried about losing that poll lead that the whole campaign has felt very controlled, activists perfectly lined up, all prepped of what to say. I mean, we were just at one in Wales and you could see press aides at the start telling people just how to hold their signs, when to clap. And I think it's because they're so nervous that they've had this poll lead, as you say, which actually hasn't budged. So I think they'll look back perhaps and say that strategy did work. But as a result, they all feel quite tense when you're around them, quite jittery, quietly cautious. They're sort of straddling this point of not wanting to lean into the idea that they've won already, but also very, very worried all the time that anything at any moment could go wrong.
Which is not to say, of course, that they didn't initially have a little bit of a wobble when dealing with the left. Diane Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn, very prominent figures on that wing of the party, and of course both standing at the election. Has Labour dealt with that problem from those who are further to the left within Labour ranks?
I would say they want to have the fight with Jeremy Corbyn. Perhaps they didn't anticipate the fight with Diane Abbott going in the way that it did. So Jeremy Corbyn's quite useful for them, right? They have this idea that they are not the party of the past. They're not the party that was led by Jeremy Corbyn. So the fact that he's around and they can say, look, he's still there, but he's not in our party anymore. He's not an MP, he's not a member, he's not in it at all. He's having to run as an independent. That works quite well for them. Diane Abbott, on the other hand, who's of a similar wing of the party, she is slightly different. She's the first female black MP. She's a bigger figure in many ways than Jeremy Corbyn. But having said that, it was all in the first week, and I think some people in the party think actually, you know, having that dealt with right at the early start of the campaign, while it was a bit messy, is kind of dealt with that issue. And since then, they haven't really, in their eyes, put a foot wrong in terms of internal problems, which has always been a problem for Labour.
But look, you've been hanging out with these people over the course of the past 6 weeks. You can't tell me that there hasn't been a degree of confidence or indeed expectation as to what is going to happen tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Yes, I think there's a quiet confidence. I think, though, in terms of this safety-first approach, it's helpful in a lot of ways, but I also think, having spent a lot of time with Keir Starmer at all of these events, you totally see why it plays well for them, because he is safety first in his character, in his essence. And I think twinning the strategy with the temperament of the man has kind of worked for them.
A fair point, but of course, when in government, I mean, one of the ways in which Keir Starmer will have to keep his party in line is by his performances at the dispatch box. And on the evidence of the two outings that we had in terms of televised debates, I have to say, I thought I was quite surprised with how poor Sir Keir Starmer is, given that he used to be a lawyer?
So I think there's a feeling within the party that the different debates have played out in different ways. So the head-to-head that you've seen, where Keir Starmer is directly up against Rishi Sunak in that one-to-one battle, they think he doesn't do so well. In these kind of sit-down, individualised interviews where they go one after the other, he seems to perform better. And this is my own personal musings on the situation. Keir Starmer tends to wait his turn, listens to the question, lets people answer. And I think perhaps the combative style of the one-to-one doesn't really work for his, I guess, legal background. PMQs doesn't work in that way. They do have their set times to speak after another, so it actually does mimic in some way kind of a hybrid of the two. So I think that's potentially why we didn't foresee Keir Starmer not performing as well as we thought.
Serena, I think we would both agree that 6 weeks of a general election is more than enough. Looking back on your time on the Labour battle bus, is there a moment that leaps out to you, that stands out as perhaps defining your time with Labour?
I think the only time I saw a bit of chink in the armour and was interesting to me was I was in a cafe with Rachel Reeves. She was about to do an interview and a protest group, a pro-climate organisation, found her. This was totally unscripted, not planned. She was totally unprepared and she walked immediately out the cafe, didn't engage with them, she just left. And I thought that was interesting because so much of this campaign is controlled that really marked out as something that was unpredictable. Politicians in this 6-week campaign were expected to meet people, talk to them, engage with people. It just showed how slick the other parts of the campaign were, but also that potentially even if they get this big majority, there are people who are unhappy with the way Labour has shifted.
Thanks, Serena. And we should say once again, of course, nothing is set in stone. Yes, Labour has had a commanding lead for the duration of the campaign, yet such are the rather slender margins in various parts of the country that anyone who tells you that they know what the seat share will be when we all wake up Friday, well, they're talking out of turn. The only thing that's certain is that Sky's team of election correspondents could really do with a sit down and a cup of tea, and that if you don't vote, your vote don't count. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again tomorrow.